heart opening. Heart can broadcast like up to 3 miles away. So many people are completely focused in relationship without understanding. I have a really interesting perspective. I actually think heated rivalry is part of the disclosure. The heart is ideally a navigator. So Dispenza is doing wonderful work with this regard. Coherence is so important. It's amazing that it's being embraced by everyone. It's riding the whole spectrum. It's this juggernaut that's just taken off. At the end of the day, people understand love. When the heart is used as navigation, decisions aren't made by weighing external approval or cultural conditioning. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Reflection Connection podcast. I'm your host, Vince Jameson. So today we're going to be discussing a couple of different topics which all intersect as per usual. Today's episode title is episode number 3, Navigating the Heart. And I want to start off by speaking about a couple of different aspects, one of which is my own experience of my heart center opening dramatically within the last 3 years, incrementally at first. So a lot of people are familiar with the heart chakra. Out of the major 7 chakras, it's the center, right? And a lot of people think still of their center being their solar plexus, their stomach. And there is some sense to this. There's I would say the center of the physicality is in the stomach and in the navel region, and the center of the energetics is in the heart. This is at least my experience. My heart center started opening up, I would say about 3 years ago, dramatically. There were a series of different events. Some of them I'll touch on, some of them I'll touch on at another time because they can be emotional, and I want to get through this without being a basket case. But one of the things that I found helpful is understanding heart-brain coherence. And I'll have to say, Joe Dispenza is doing wonderful work in this regard. In fact, if you're familiar with his work, this is the focus. He does workshops, of course, and has developed some recordings, some of which are available readily online. And he has you focus in the heart. This was something which I discovered or became more aware of a little later on, but I actually find the recordings really, really helpful. One of the things that's been really beneficial for me is keeping my awareness on the heart and in the heart center. I think it does become a little easier once you start to feel it open. You'll feel almost like an ache sometimes if you really delve into the center. And I'll back up a little bit because I see I'm touching myself and you're not even seeing. But there's almost, it's not where the physical heart is, right? It's here, it's below the thymus gland. So that where there's the kind of a forward bone protrusion, I guess, in your chest, right? For me, I feel it below there, and even sometimes like right around there. And so when the heart opens, there are many aspects to it, energetic aspects in which a lot of what would be considered psychic elements can start to open. Most people are familiar with the third eye, and that is true, but there are also some that open with the heart. As you start to move through and beyond the lower centers, and when I say lower, I don't mean to have any kind of judgment against them, but they're a little more primally focused. They're a little more materially focused. And it's important to have those aspects intact. You don't want to bypass them because we live in a material, physical experience. But as you start to move upward, the heart starts to open. And this, I think, is a little easier because of the context of our society for a lot of women. You'll see women kind of crying during a movie at the drop of a hat at a wedding or something. It's commonplace. Men, not so much. Some men and some cultures are a lot more open where men will, as they say, wear their heart on their sleeve. But for many cultures still, even in this modern age, men tend to be a little more withdrawn or closed in that regard for protective reasons. And again, of course, this is a really big generalization, but just something that I've come across. And even speaking for me, I was a very open-hearted, empathic, super loving, super sensitive child. And through just having to grow up in systems and society and finding my way, I started to close it. And by the time I got into my teenage years, and especially my late teens and early 20s, it was closed off. I was really a mentally focused, ego-driven, just kind of radical expression that I was focused in at that period of my life. And the heart didn't start opening until much, much later. I would say more towards my, I wouldn't want to say maybe like later 30s. Yeah. It was elements and moments, right? In between then, of course, moments of deep opening, but then a quick contraction. It wasn't until I really started delving into nature, really started connecting in that way, and then had several different experiences. One of them was a more complete acceptance of myself. And that's something which has been a journey. And I think that's something as a journey for a lot of people. Um, you can look at someone with a fair amount of confidence and just assume that they love and accept themselves. And to a certain degree, they probably do, but there are usually degrees and aspects that aren't fully accepted. And, for me, growing up as a gay man, being born in the 70s, so I kind of grew up in the 80s where there was this whole like AIDS thing, which was super scary and confusing. And then in the 90s, in my unique experience, being in New York City and having the opportunity to, well, I headed into the nightclub rave scene, which was in one way radically open, right? But in another way, there was still the context and still the barriers there. We were also open with each other, but if you really were involved in the scenes, there were very distinct categorizations. You might have like risen to the top per se, right? But there were still hierarchies within that. And being gay was put into a certain hierarchy, though it was completely accepted, but there were certain things that you weren't going to do. There were certain things that you might not be invited to, even the fact of just interactions with women. And so, like a lot of young men, I, rode the bisexual conversation for a bit. And it wasn't until, later on into my 20s when I really accepted that and moved through it, as many people do. And, for anyone who has gone through that journey, it's usually a wonderful relief. And we usually will imagine much worse than what it is, although sometimes people have a really difficult time even afterward. And that's valid, right? There are as many different contexts as there are people. But I say that because it's really important to learn to love the fullness of yourself. And even this is not what I would consider an ugly part, but even some of the ugly parts, I think it's even to get to know some of the shadow, right? Shadow work was a big conversation a number of years ago, and I think it still is to some degree. It's moved a little more into somatics, which is actually, I think, really helpful. But the idea of understanding your darkest side, your darkest thoughts, your darkest moments, right? And embracing them with compassion and understanding. And then also in doing that, you can then bring them into an evolution and work with them and understand them. And so this isn't a confessional, so we're not going there, but just everyone has their stuff, right? Everyone has their stuff. And to the highest degrees, because I've met some of these people, everyone has their stuff. And so, yeah, there's a saying that I heard many years ago, and it's true. It's much more important to be whole than to be good. And one of the things, especially within the spirituality construct, is we have, for the most part here in the West, we come from a very puritanical perspective for so many generations. And it's this idea of being good and being good and doing the right thing. And how can I say this? There isn't a right thing in reality, right? There's the idea of the left-hand path, and we don't need to go down that road. But everything serves its place and its purpose. Even as I call them sometimes, even the nasties or the people who are doing dastardly deeds, they serve their purpose and they have their place. The context of being good and the context of being loving and the context of living by a certain code can help to ensure that you live a more happy life where your interactions are more enjoyable, more harmonious. You're creating less harm, you're creating less chaos for others, which then will come back to you in a more harmonious experience. From a universal, like way huge macro perspective, there really isn't a right and a wrong. And these things become more fluid. In my perspective, I think that there are amazing souls who come in and take roles in order to move agendas forward, which ultimately serves the evolution of humanity and of life. And the contrast that they create is helpful, even though we don't enjoy it. I don't. I know most of anyone listening to this does not. And so, yeah, but embracing oneself fully, and I think that this is also one of the wonderful things is the embracing of different lifestyles and also different experiences. And I think that the younger generations are a little more in tune with this. I think they come in with it. I think for some of the older generations, it's more of a shift in focus. I think you can understand it from a heart perspective, but from the way that many people grew up, it didn't seem like reality or a realistic, you know, aspect to life, right? Just like in the idea of bullying per se, right? So when I was growing up, bullying was expected. Even when I speak to my mom, she's like, "Oh, get over it. It's part of life." And now they're finally addressing it to even like Lady Gaga many years ago, regardless what you think of her, she made it like a bit of a campaign. And I think it was wonderful, right? Who wants to be bullied? Who wants to go to school and feel inferior or be made? And especially now with kids that are all online and they're everything on their phones, and it has a lot longer lifespan than someone calling someone names, right? And so yeah, they have their own stuff to deal with. But the heart, it's really a multifaceted aspect. And I really love the idea of this kind of increased self-love as a focus for it, as well as keeping just your physical conscious attention there. One of the things that I wanted to touch upon, and it's interesting, I didn't, well, I didn't think of, I considered touching upon it, but I will, because it led into the conversation. Right now, unless you've been living under a rock, and I live in a bubble. I do live in a bubble. I don't watch news. I don't allow that to come even through my feeds and on social media. My Instagram is very, very curated, and I will not click on certain things even if they come through. So everything about it is uplifting and nice and harmonious and to my interest completely. So I live in a bubble. I do. I've lived in a bubble for years. And I allow the universe to speak to me through other people. When I need to know something, it'll come to me, and it always does, whether it's a storm coming or some kind of like social thing. So a friend of mine recently introduced the Heated Rivalry, which again, unless you've been living under a rock, it's become this huge cultural juggernaut. And I really enjoyed it. I was impressed with it, I have to say. Um, for me, it was actually a little over sexualized, but I understand the whole reason for it. I mean, of course, it was the sex that sold it for those who've seen it, but I think clearly the expression of love and the character arcs, that made it what it is. But I also want to propose, I've been thinking about this quite a lot because, of course, true to form, as I just stated, I have this perfect Instagram, right? And as soon as you do click on something, it opens up this world. And so someone sent me a couple of things regarding the show, and when I open them up, of course, now it's all over my feed. But it was interesting because I delved into it a little bit, and there's this hysteria, and it's not only from gay men or younger gay men, which would be understandable. So in my perspective, one of the things that I really liked about this, and I think it's become a conversation amongst a lot of different arenas in life, is the importance of representation. And for a gay man, growing up, I had AIDS, outcast, um, maybe something to be made fun of, definitely something to hide, right? And then I come into my teenage years. Again, this was a more rarefied experience because I was in New York in the early to mid to late 90s was kind of my time, my growing up. And especially in that culture, there was a lot of acceptance, right? And there were every kind of form and every person out there. But at the same time, too, there was still the contrast. And within society, we had Will and Grace, right, on TV, which was huge because it showed Will as someone who was successful and someone who was respected. And then it showed Jack, which was more of the kind of the caricature, kind of more of like flamboyant and funny, but it was jokes on him kind of thing, right? And then, of course, everybody knows what happened with Ellen, who was canceled, and then she came back. And it's been this, for me, it's been just to observe this really interesting cultural shift over time. And it gets pulled back and pushed forward and pulled back and pushed forward. And then all of the conservatives were after the drag queens. And it's a whole nother conversation for another day. So ridiculous. Because all the drag queens want to get your kids through the library. That's the anyway. This was unapologetic. So there's no shortage of like gay themed like miniseries and movies online, right? But they're usually crappy. They're usually like either basically softcore porn with no story, and like you can't relate to any of the characters, if that, or they're like these drawn out things and kind of like really, really getting into, I don't know, I don't resonate with a lot of it. A lot of people don't, and it's really not my thing. And I wouldn't have watched this. I actually saw it advertised, and I saw the image, and I was like, "Oh, you're not going to watch that," until I had a recommendation, and from the person who I actually respect. And so it was really unapologetic in both its portrayals of sex, which was just right out there. But you had this like hyper masculine sports guy, right? Ilya. And then you have this like, on the spectrum kind of softer, but still very masculine Shane. And then there was that Kip, I think was his name, Kip. Yeah. Who had a little swish in him, which I like that they interjected that. So it wasn't like trying to be one thing. My point in this and bringing this up is if you've watched the shows, which I binged and it was great, there's the sexual component which gets your attention, but then there's like this really interesting context of forbidden love, which is so sad that it still exists. This isn't from the 90s. This isn't from 1960s. This isn't from 1800s. This is the teens and moving into now. And of course, we're speaking about a hyper heteronormative, at least on the outside, sports kind of context, right? But still, this exists. And as I alluded to before, there was something that impacted me, right? And I thought this was like a really beautiful portrayal. I loved the whole thing and I was recommending it. And then I started to watch like culturally from the outside because I was immune to all of it beforehand. women embracing it. And I understand because it's explained to me over time the context of women who identify as lesbian who like to watch gay porn. I get it because it's been explained to me, but I kind of don't, because if it was reversed, we generally don't like that. Um, just it is what it is. But then also too, you have all of these straight women, like a lot of them, and then I'm seeing straight women on podcasts, and then you have like Oprah and Gail, and then you have um, straight men who are sports people who are watching it and crying. And I think that's something that's really, really beautiful. I wish I had her name because this was such a wonderful quote, but there's something that popped up on my Instagram and I didn't save it. In fact, I looked for it for like half an hour because I wanted to give them credit. Three people, I believe it was two girls and a guy. It may have been from another podcast. And the girl was saying something which I thought was brilliant. And she said something to the effect of, I might be paraphrasing, but I'll try to get it right. She said something to the effect of, for anybody who questions if homosexuality or being gay is a choice, that's only because they've made the choice and they chose to be straight. And I was like, wow, mic drop. It's so profound. And it's true. I mean, there have been multiple tests. There was a test done with people who swore that they were straight to the point that like they were disgusted by everything gay. And then, people who were kind of in between, and they actually like showed them, I believe, porn or situations and measured their erection or their erection activity. And no surprise, the ones that were like, ew, I don't want to see it, gross, take it off, that's against my religion, ew, and they're disgusting. Of course, they were the ones that were, being most aroused or being highly aroused by it. And yeah, I think that it's something which we're still moving through, but there's something to which even the show spoke about, right? It's like this locker room talk. It's this idea of having to be protected and having to, I even did it, I even did it as a kid. I remember like my first experience of seeing a naked man was in a nudie magazine and like the weeds by my grandmother's house with this kid Bobby who showed me this straight thing. And he was like, don't look at the guy because it'll make you gay. And it's this context where in order to be protective, because it's not socially accepted, people would deny. But this is a really interesting point, and I think a lot of people, especially people who are not gay men, or on the spectrum of like queerness, which is another interesting thing because it was such a slur. Queer was such a slur for such a long time, and for me growing up, and to see that that's been reclaimed and embraced, and how young people use it as an idea of fluidity, which is also interesting for me, because I'm just an old-fashioned plain gay guy. But anyway, what a lot of people don't realize is this kind of like this idea of self-rejection leads to a lot of other kinds of behaviors. So this idea of self-rejection, when you're not accepting yourself fully, when you're wishing that you can be different, and when even if it's not true, but in your mind, in your consciousness, you feel and know that everyone is going to reject you if you were to come out, or you can't imagine living like that because you see those people struggle because it hasn't been portrayed in a healthy way. Um, and you don't have any context, maybe especially for people who are outside of major cities, it becomes really difficult. And a lot of those people wind up living very hidden lives. And that's really portrayed in this, right? This whole idea of like forbidden love. But what it often does is it leads to, I don't want to be judgmental in this, but in the sense of like the idea of guys cruising and really casual encounters that sometimes can be, often they're drunk or high or something, and they can sometimes be dangerous and lead to dangerous outcomes. And sometimes people don't care because there's an underlying self-hatred that exists, which is really sad that it still exists in these days and in these times. And, to see the character arc of these people struggling with that to one degree or another and portraying it in a really beautiful way. I thought the writing was really well written. It was interesting because I found out that it came from a book, and the book is actually, I heard one of the characters, his name is Hudson, one of the main characters, talk about hockey smut. And I was like, what is he talking about? And then I saw them reading from it. And the show is actually so much more tame than apparently the book is, or the books. There are a series of books. But I thought it was a really beautiful portrayal. And I think that this also ties in. So I was reflecting and I was like, why is this becoming such a cultural kind of juggernaut? Why is it everywhere? And like everyone's interested and everyone's talking about it. It's like building instead of slowing down. And I feel like this might be abstract and it's hard to formulate, but for those of you like who get it, like I feel like this is actually an aspect of disclosure, not in disclosure in the sense that they were part of something and so this is being disclosed because there's nothing in that regard, but in an abstract way, the energetics of it, I think that part of the disclosure that a lot of people are talking about and hinting at what's to come in 2026 is somewhat about disclosing in a literal context as to what has been intentionally hidden. But I think there's also a more subtle energetic component of it, which is disclosing that which is natural aspects of who we are. And so even if you're going into, let's say, the UFO or the interdimensional disclosure, the idea of aliens, right, or something, and so that's been a cover up, and most people are aware of this, and that's being slowly disclosed. But there's also the underlying kind of more abstractness, which is that we are genetically part of that, many of us, well, all of us to some degree. And this will be more and more revealed over time and digested by different people. And this for me had an element of that in a really subtle way of just providing at this time this kind of real, like, it was almost like a punch, into the last bit of like wall, right? That has been up, and especially this for those who are in the U.S. or well, the world knows about the U.S. and our administration. This counter to all of these progressive, more inclusionary and accepting aspects that we've slowly moved and progressed into, to this kind of like slamming of the wall. And there's some degree that I get for that because a lot of older generations are fearful and are made to be fearful and are riding on fearful conversations. But not even touching on that, I think that there's been a closure and this kind of just gave it like a sucker punch and that they didn't even realize. And I think it's really healthy. And my prediction out of this, which I don't think is so abstract at all, I think we're going to have an incredible, incredible, profound public as well as private wave of people coming out. People who have been on the fence, people who have been hiding it, people who are in sports, media, entertainment, especially because those are going to be most visible. But then I think there's also going to be this huge wave in the private sector, in everyday people living everyday lives who have been maybe even of an older generation that have really felt touched by this and felt this was their push, this was their sign, this was their signal, as well as some of the younger generations who still might not be completely comfortable with it. I think it's wonderful. And I think that part of it is the huge cultural acceptance, which allows for the continuation and the building of this momentum, right? And also the building of, and the allowance for all of these people that I'm sure will come forth. And I think that's really, really important. And again, this is so to get back to the main conversation, this is so intrinsic for the heart center and for opening of the heart is to fully embrace the fullness of the self and to not say this is good and this is bad, but this is me, this is who I am. And maybe there are aspects which can be, I really love the term beautified because it doesn't hold judgment, but maybe there are aspects of this which I can make more beautiful. How can I take this anger in me? How can I take this, this tendency, which I don't love, accept it and beautify it. How can I turn this into a more beautiful way of speaking? How can I turn this into a more beautiful way of acting? How can I take this, which is something that I've been made fun of my whole life, and make it shine, right? And in doing that, it's like your energy just expands and the heart starts to open and expand. One of the things that the heart can do is to navigate. And I've seen and heard of some of this in regards to being used for manifestation, and that's very valid. But I think in a more general perspective as well, the heart center can be a wonderful opening towards an increase in intuition, as well as an increase in your everyday navigation. And the more that you can hold your attention to the heart and the heart center, and it really can be also opened up further by concentrating on aspects of love. One of the easiest things I think most people are familiar with, like the idea of a broken heart and feeling even heart pain in a breakup, or when someone transitions that they love, and it's like you feel that, like that wrench in your heart. I would encourage to approach it a little more neutrally. So, especially those of us who are animal lovers out there, I think that most of us can find our animals as less of a push pull, or less contrast within the loving experience than, let's say, a partner or a love interest or even a family member who might be great. Unless maybe it's like grandma who's never said boo, right? But if you can concentrate on that relationship and that feeling that you have with that expression, with that individual, with that other, right? That experience of otherness, and you can hold the consciousness of them and hold that idea of them while you're concentrating on your heart center. I'll move back because I keep on touching myself and you can't see, but and continue to hold it, not just like wait until you start to feel the experience. And then what you'll find, and it's interesting, and this might not sell it, but I'm not trying to sell anything here. What you'll find, excuse me, is when it does open, generally you'll know by, especially for men, and I alluded to this earlier, you become like a big crybaby. I mean, seriously, like I now cry at the drop of a hat. Not like a ugly cry, right? But like tears, where that was not something that was part of my experience for most of my life, to the point that I've done walks and stuff where I get really connected with nature and my heart just expands. I've been on walks where, like, I'm in the neighborhood and I've got tears running down my face because I just feel so connected to everything and every aspect, and am so filled with love and appreciation in that moment that is just tears of just love and joy and connection that can't really be described in words because it's so far beyond what language can convey. And then I'm just like, like the neighbor's coming. I gotta pull myself together. You know, come on, Vince, get with it, get with it. Let's pull ourselves together. You know, like, but the flower is so beautiful. Everything is so beautiful, and if you've touched upon that, you'll get where I'm coming from. And if you haven't ever come near that, you might think that what I just sounds is ridiculous. But I tell you, it is so much more profound and beautiful than almost any experience of love that I've experienced. And I've experienced some really deep love. And I will use my pets, though, as an entry point. And I think that that's a really good way. And again, with Joe Dispenza, if you can really concentrate on it, he does offer some recordings that do that. I think it's called like LUV or LOV or something, or Go Love, something like that. You can find it on YouTube. Anyway, this heart space can help you to navigate. It can also harmonize your surroundings. I was keeping my attention on my heart, and I started to realize a shift in my surrounding, a shift in how I saw things and how people were showing up for me. And there's an app that I use. It's called the Mindfulness app. You can get it at the App Store. There's the paid, I think it goes monthly, if I'm not incorrect. You can get it for free and you can set it up, but the quality of the alarms isn't great. And if you pay for it, even for a month, you can download the better ding. Anyway, there's one that sounds like a chime that I would actually use, and that's what I use. And I set it for 15 minutes. And you might even hear it sometimes in the podcast go off on my phone. I know that it has. And it's just this ding. And it goes off every 15 minutes. And it reminds me to recenter into my heart. And it does so successfully. And I would say realistically, at the beginning, I was using it almost every time. Now, sometimes I'm busy and I'm like, oh, like get off the phone. I'm trying to like look at something. It's wonderful when I do use it regularly, and it has me center there more than I would if I wasn't using it. And I noticed a really dramatic shift since doing that. And so you can use the heart as navigation of holding your consciousness there and then using that guidance, which is much more in tune with your intuition rather than the head. We were taught for so long to be head focused, mind focused, and IQ and the mind being superior and think about it instead of feeling. Slowly it's coming across culturally. We're getting into somatics and the idea of emotional intelligence rather than IQ. And all of these things have slowly trickled into society and are expanding, but we're still so mentally focused, and that's where a lot of our problem goes. I'm not saying ignore the mind. The mind is a wonderful thing, but the mind is meant to be a tool. It's not meant to be like the main focus. And it's like, I've heard the analogy of the mind as a knife because it cuts and dissects. Most of us are living in a completely cut and dissected world, and we'll even cut and dissect ourselves and harm ourselves with our mind. It can be out of control. And if you hear about these states that people achieve, and I was lucky to have held that space for a time. It's not at this moment part of my regular experience, but I have touched upon it a number of times. The mind is empty, and it's not by force. It's empty. There's not a thought, there's not a song, there's not nothing unless you actively choose to use it. Otherwise, you're existing. And in that state, you're open to everything. You know something when you need to know it. In that moment that comes, because you're moment by moment unfolding. There's no past, future, reflection. Everything is new. Everything is joyous. It's wonderful. And that is something to aspire towards. And there are exercises. And in fact, I think that that's a good segue for our next episode. And so I'll leave you off with this. I hope that I've given some information to incorporate into your daily experience. So if you've enjoyed the conversation, please go ahead and subscribe, give me a rating and maybe leave a comment. Thank you for joining me. And I hope that you've, enjoyed this, my ramblings. And until next time, my friends, I hope that this podcast just reminds you of all that you truly are and all that you already are connected to. Until then.